It's quite a strange feeling, really, as an illustrator, to kind of realise that somebody's whole idea of what Jonah and the giant fish looks like is based on a picture that I drew 15 years ago.
Welcome to the Jesus Storybook Bible podcast, a place where we remind you that grace can rewrite any story, that hope shines a light through our darkest moments, and that God's love changes lives. Here's your host, New York Times bestselling author, Sally Lloyd Jones.
Hello, I'm Sally Lloyd Jones, author of the Jesus Storybook Bible, which tells the story of God's never stopping, never giving up, unbreaking, always and forever love. Welcome to the show. I first came across our next guest when I was working as an editor and art director in children's publishing. I hadn't yet taken the plunge into writing full-time. I was kind of on the wrong side of the desk, as I like to think of it, working on other people's writing. But anyway, I was attending a big book fair called Book Expo at the Javits Center in New York City. And as I walked around, I was always on the lookout for great new illustrators I might be able to use. So when I saw this particular illustrator's work, I took a printout and filed it in my folder of artists I'd like to work with someday. Fast forward a few years later, I'd left publishing and was writing full-time by then. When Zondervan had a couple of full starts with the illustrator of the Jesus Storybook Bible, I decided it was time I went into high gear. And I reached out to the illustrator's agent, found out that he was free, and asked him to send some samples. Of course, I'm talking about Jago. And the rest, of course, is history. I'll let Jago tell you his story. But Jago and I are both amazed at the perfect timing of it all. When I was in the middle of the full starts, it didn't seem very perfect at all. It only felt frustrating, and I despaired of my book ever coming out in the way I knew it needed to. But I look back now and I thank God for those full starts, because they led me to Jago. Tim Keller says this, which I love. If we knew everything God knows about what He's doing in our lives, we would cheer Him on. Cheer Him on. I hope to get better at remembering that, don't you? And thanking God ahead of time when those false starts happen. Instead of panicking and thinking, oh no, what am I going to do now? Everything's awful, everything's going wrong. To think instead, I wonder what God is up to. I think I've also heard it put like this: our disappointments are God's appointments. So anyway, I wanted to share that little bit of behind-the-scenes story with you, in case there's anyone listening who might need to be encouraged. Because God has a way of working with impossible-seeming situations. In fact, they do seem to be His favorite, His speciality, making a way where there is no way. One of the other wonderful things about the false starts and the struggle is, I'm in no doubt whatsoever about who the author of this book's success is. And to Him all the glory and praise and thanks belong. And now it's time to hear from the illustrator himself. There are so many wonderful things I could say about his work, but here are just some. The most important to me is that Jago's illustrations are full of heart. And the other thing is, full of humor. And perhaps most telling of all, and I've seen this again and again, his art miraculously reaches every age. It could be a 1-year-old infant. It could be a teenager. It could be an elderly person. It doesn't matter. It seems that his art is universal. And I couldn't be more grateful that Jago was the illustrator of the Jesus Storybook Bible. So, without further ado, please welcome my dear friend and now yours, Jago Silva.
I'm Jago. I'm an illustrator, which means I'm lucky enough to draw pictures for a living. I've been doing this since 2003, so almost 20 years now. I've worked on over 60 books, sold 6 million of them, and won 21 awards over the years. So I had a slightly strange introduction into my art career because I actually wanted to be an archaeologist. So when I went to college, I did a whole load of science and history A-levels and actually got a place to study archaeology at a little university in Wales. And then kind of during the summer, when I should have been reading up on lots of archaeological journals, I was just spending all my time messing around on the computer trying to make pictures. My mum is an art teacher and my dad's a potter. And I think both of them were just kind of waiting for the penny to drop that maybe archaeology wasn't actually for me, but didn't really want to push me into anything. And so then over that summer, I kind of came to the realization that although I liked archaeology, I wasn't really interested enough in it to go and do a degree. But I didn't have any art qualifications. So I went back to college and kind of talked my way onto an art and design course with a little sketchbook of pictures that I'd done over the summer. And so then I did an art qualification, which then got me onto an illustration degree course in Falmouth, which is quite a unique place because it's a kind of university in a very small town in Cornwall by the sea. And I actually ended up with invitations from 2 different publishers at my degree show, which was a great start. So I went off and spoke to those and ended up with a 5-book deal between these 2 different publishers straight out of college, which I wasn't really expecting. All of our university lecturers had been kind of drumming it into us that it was going to be a sort of long, hard slog and we wouldn't expect to kind of get any kind of a success for a very long time. And so I'd just sort of been assuming that would be how it worked. And then literally ended up with 5 picture books straight off the bat, which was exciting, but also a bit daunting because although I've always loved picture books, I'd never done one before, obviously. So it was a bit of a baptism of fire, my first picture book. We were kind of shown the various different types of illustration you could do. And to me, picture books seem to fit quite nicely in terms of, on the one hand, you have editorial illustrations for magazines, newspapers, which is always very high pressure and short deadlines. And you're often only producing one piece of work. And then you might have sort of advertising work, which can be very well paid, but also very high pressure. And I think I've always enjoyed picture books. My auntie, when I was young, used to work at a library, and every now and again they'd get rid of picture books that were too old, and she'd give them all to me. So I still have quite a lot of them, actually. So I have a huge collection of picture books, lots of them from the sort of 60s and 70s, which I've kind of grown up with. So I've always been fascinated by picture books, I think, from a young age. So when I was doing my illustration degree, it just kind of seemed natural that was what I would gravitate towards. It was a good amount of work because you were doing a whole series of pictures rather than just one. But it wasn't that kind of high pressure environment of having to churn something out in a matter of days or hours. So I think it was a combination of all those things that led me into that, really. So I think I've always enjoyed the idea that illustrations, good illustrations, if you look at the picture on its own, they should kind of make you wonder what's going on and what's going to happen next. And I remember when I was doing my degree being really struck by some illustrators who could, in a kind of a single image, just make you wonder what was going on and what was about to happen, or maybe suggest that something terrible or wonderful was about to happen. One of my favourite recent books is by John Classen about Sam and Dave dig a hole, I think that's what it's called. And it's just quite a simple story of 2 boys digging a hole in the ground looking for something. But the illustrations show all of the things that they're missing, which I just think is a brilliant kind of visual gag. And I can just imagine children being delighted by the fact that these 2 boys keep missing these amazing things that they're digging past. And but the text doesn't kind of reveal any of that at all. The text is quite straight. So I think I've always kind of liked that thing that pictures can give you extra information or sometimes contradictory information to what's in the text. And I guess when I'm doing my illustrations, I try to remember what it was like as a child to look at the pictures while I'm drawing them. And there's certain illustrations that still kind of stand out to me from my own childhood. And when I look back at them now, they're not necessarily illustrations that I like in an artistic sense, but they've obviously had something that made me remember them, that made them stick in my head. And I think my own children have helped too. My wife and I have always read them stories. And I always think it's interesting to see which bits of a book they really like or don't like, and which bits they memorize. There's particular stories that we've read them over the years. I think I could probably still tell you all of the words to them. And there's certain illustrations that they kind of look forward to seeing. In terms of actually meeting Sally in real life, I didn't actually meet her until some point after the Jesus Storybook Bible was finished. She lives in New York and I live in Cornwall in the UK. But by a bizarre coincidence, she happens to visit members of her family in a village a few miles away from where I live every summer, which we didn't know in advance. And so we actually ended up meeting up several times because of that strange coincidence. And we've met several times since then, including on a couple of UK book tours, which were quite good fun. But in terms of how I came to work with Sally, there was quite a nice story to this, that she'd seen my very first published book, which was called Fig's Giant, at a book fair. But in her previous life, when she was working for a publisher, she had been at one of these book fairs and she'd happened to spot this book, and she remembered my name. And when they were going through the commissioning process for the Jesus Storybook Bible, she suggested me because she remembered this book from many years before. And I got a message from my agent saying, considering you for this book, but they'd like to see some samples of your work. And was there any chance I could post them a couple of books? And this being 15, 16 years ago, there was less kind of options for sharing things digitally. So I literally needed to post some samples to America. And they told me, they'd really quite like to have them in a couple of days' time. And I looked up the shipping rates and was quite horrified. It was going to cost me more than £100 to send something to America by FedEx. And I'd never even used FedEx before. It's not really, at that time, it wasn't really a common thing to use in the UK at all. So I kind of deliberated over whether I could literally afford to do this. And I think my agent said she'd pay me back if things didn't work out. So I eventually kind of bit the bullet and booked this FedEx collection, which was all quite exciting at the time. And this guy came along in a FedEx uniform, collected the books and took them away. And I later heard from Sally that my books were literally delivered by a FedEx person during a meeting about which illustrators to use for the book. And they hadn't been able to find exactly the right person. And then this FedEx delivery guy literally turns up during the meeting with an envelope with my books in. And Sally was like, yep, these are the kind of illustrations we should have. So there was a nice bit of serendipity there. So in terms of actually working on the book, I was really lucky that the publisher commissioned a wonderful designer called Julie Chen to work on the layout of the book. She really doesn't get enough credit for her role in this. And Julie and Sally had worked together to decide on the content of the illustrations. So when I came on board, they already had that organized. And with, I think, close to 180 illustrations to work through, I'm really glad that they'd done that. As it was, it took me 10 months to illustrate the book. So if I'd had to kind of start from scratch, I can't imagine how long it would take. In fact, during those 10 months, I also bought my first house, and my wife and I had our first child. So we packed a lot into those 10 months. But the publisher were great. I had really detailed notes on kind of what they wanted on each spread and how to arrange it. And they had a really good system of feedback. So we kind of kept everything on schedule really well, which I think if we'd done it any other way, it could have lasted for years, really, because the amount of work involved was just colossal. Okay, so trying to pick a favourite illustration out of 180 is really tricky. But so I've kind of cheated it, because I guess I've picked two, and they're probably not necessarily my favourites, because if you asked me tomorrow, I'd probably pick two different ones. But so what I've picked is The Warrior Leader, which is on page 109 and 111 in my book. So this one really stuck in my mind, because I remember I was looking at lots of reference of Middle Eastern architecture for inspiration for the city of Jericho. And what I was trying to do was to try and kind of simplify a city into a sort of single large building, because I kind of wanted it to be obvious and dramatic when the walls came down, and trying to draw an entire city collapsing was quite tricky within the confines of a picture book. So I came up with this idea that the whole city would basically be kind of like one large castle. And for some reason, I decided it was going to be this sort of complicated 10-sided shape. I think that's called a decagon. And so it was a great idea in theory, but then when I started trying to draw it, I realized that was a really complicated shape to draw. And not only was it really complicated to draw, but I was actually going to have to draw the city more than once and from different viewpoints. The way I solved it was I built a 3D model of it on my computer, which I could then sort of turn around and look at from different directions. And I used that as the basis for the illustrations. And I remember feeling quite pleased with myself at the time. That seemed like quite a clever solution to a tricky problem, and possibly just a way of getting around having to draw something really complicated as well. But if you ask me tomorrow, it would probably be a different illustration. But today, that's the one that sticks in my mind. When me and Sally have been on these little book tours that we've done, I do find it quite kind of overwhelming when you sort of step back and think that there's a whole generation, multiple generations, I guess, of children who've grown up with that as their version of all of these stories, and that when they think about these characters and people in this book, that what they're picturing is the pictures that I drew 15 years ago for it. It's quite a strange feeling, really, as an illustrator, to kind of realise that somebody's whole idea of what Jonah and the giant fish looks like is based on a picture that I drew 15 years ago.
You can get the Jesus Storybook Bible wherever books are sold. To find out more about the book and all of Sally's other books, please visit Sally at sallylloyd-jones.com and follow her on Instagram at Sally Lloyd Jones and at Jesus_Storybook_Bible.
Before we go, don't forget, God loves you with a never stopping, never giving up, unbreaking, always and forever love. Oh, hello, it's me again, Sally. I'm just popping back briefly to say two things. The first thing is, don't forget to subscribe to the show, because that way you'll get the stories straight to your phone. And the other thing is, while we're at it, would you rate the show and leave us a review? That would be so great, because it helps other people find the show too. I really appreciate your help. Thank you.